Good evening, everybody. Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CLC lecture series organized by the Center of Livable Cities. My name is Shiming. I'm from the CLC. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. In today's session, we are honored to have with us Mr. Bruno Wildermuth, Principal Consultant and Owner of Wildermuth Consulting, and Mr. Menon Gopinath, Senior Research Fellow from the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering of NTU. In this lecture, they will share with us the experiences and insight on making Singapore more pedestrian-friendly. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Mr. Wildermuth and another presentation by Mr. Menon, followed by a Q&A session with the audience, moderated by Mr. Jeremy Yap, Deputy Chief Executive of the Public Transport Policy and Planning Division of the Land Transport Authority. We will now welcome Mr. Wildermuth to deliver his presentation. Mr. Wildermuth, please.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. While the main subject of today's series focuses on pedestrian friendliness, I would like to start out with a few points about the initial MRT that are little known. As many of you know, I have been heavily involved in the implementation, the development of the initial MRT system. So while we're concentrating on pedestrian friendliness, our planning effort, which is essential, you might find my talk emphasizing more on how to improve the current situation that I find is less desirable and really needs urgent attention. Briefly, this is the contents of my discussion, and let's get going on a few points about the MRT. Originally, the State City Planning Project had suggested an alignment going from Toa Payoh via the Kallang Basin to connect to the east-west line. The civil engineers on our team were very much in favor of that alignment. It was for simpler construction as an overhead system. However, our analytical work, based on where people would prefer to travel, suggested going through Orchard Road, and hence requiring an underground alignment. It wasn't really where people wanted to go. And so we had a lot of effort, numerous cost-benefit analysis. Every time we showed that there would be more benefits going through Orchard Road. And so even the Hansen team during the MRT debate argued against doing that. They said that if we needed to build an MRT, build it where it's cheap and easy to build. Luckily, I was able to convince the then Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, to accept the recommended system. And once the system was completed, it was proven beyond reasonable doubt, because the maximum low point actually showed up on that stretch there between, I guess it's hard to see here, between Novena and Newton, so clearly vindicating our effort to go there. That was just one of the things that perhaps not many people know, that we actually struggled to go through Orchard Road. The next thing was, of course, extending the MRT to Woodlands. While we were still building the original MRT, I was asked to study which of the two options would best serve Woodlands. Going up from Yishun, extending the north-south line, or extending the Bukit Batok branch up to reach Woodlands. Nobody talked about anything else. However, my response was that if I needed to do the study, we need to look at a third option, and that is to complete the loop. And of course, again, all the studies we did, cost-benefit analysis, everything, we ended up building the loop because only the loop made sense and was really. Now, apart from providing connectivity to the central area, to the east and the west, the Woodlands Loop contained another first. The bus interchange on the bottom of the station on top. Thus, a long-standing issue was resolved about bringing bus interchanges and MRT stations close together. That was the first time I had been arguing for that about, long time, to the point where got up to cabinet in the discussions, but eventually we got it at the Woodlands line. The third and final point about what's relatively little known. 10 days ago, the MRT extension from Chukun to Tuas Link was officially opened. When the then Transport Minister Raymond Lim announced the extension of the Western line from Boon Lay to Chukun and eventually Tuas, little did he know that the section from Lakeside to Boon Lay was actually scrapped at one time. That big yellow point there on the graph, and it was not what happened. I read it actually one morning in the newspaper, and hadn't been involved in the discussions about scrapping it. It was just too difficult for the engineering team to think about how to get around the antenna towers that were there at the time. Of course, I was aware of the antenna towers being moved for other projects because as the then planning manager, I was informed about everything that happened in the vicinity of the alignment. So I quietly went to work and worked with the authority in charge of the antenna towers to arrange how we could move the two towers that were in our place. And so eventually I was able to convince our board of directors to spend the extra money to move the towers and get us going. And needless to say, now we were opening a bit later than originally scheduled, but we made it possible for today's extension, which now goes all the way to Tuas Link. So those were sort of 3 points little known about the MRT. So when we're talking about making pedestrian the key people, so to speak, providing sidewalks along entrances to MRT stations was what really brought me to worry about pedestrians. One would think that getting the customer safely to your business is an obvious concern. However, in the days of building the original MRT, the basic philosophy was that our responsibility strictly ended at the station box. And so people getting to and from the station was somebody else's responsibility. Presumably the roads department in those days, which was part of the National Development Ministry, while the MRT Corporation was part of the Ministry of Communications. And the earliest problem actually was Bichen Station, which you see what it looks like today. Can you imagine, there wasn't even a sidewalk alongside the station. And I really had to fight hard with our management to at least build a sidewalk so that people could be safe to get in and out of the station. And of course, another one was Lakeside Station. Again, today, it was a real difference compared to what it was in those days. When we actually were ready to open the Lakeside Station, I warned my boss that the minister might trip while he's coming for the opening. That's how poor the sidewalk was in those days. And so reluctantly, he agreed to repave the sidewalk in front of the station. Actually, across the station, Lakeside Station, there was a big fence that blocked off anybody who wanted to walk across from the nearby housing developments and force people to go, quite a bit of detours. Because in those days, simply access to and from the stations was, presumably nobody's responsibility. Before we opened actually Lakeside Station, we had experienced some problems at Clementi Station, where HDB had sort of refused to provide a straight path from the station to the bus interchange. And that didn't change until one day on a rainy day, a lady fell on the sort of path that people had formed, and somehow the newspaper got hold of it and published a picture. And that really changed the situation, and we got to support to do things in a better way. So really, I'm very happy on having revisited these two stations recently to take a picture, that we have really made progress in terms of coordination. And of course, I believe now access is all part of the LTA, and therefore we have full cooperation, and we end up with bus stops in front of the stations, overhead crossings, although I'm not in favor of overhead crossings, but at least they provide safe access to and from. So on our MRT project, therefore, to actually build an underpass was not a trivial issue. The first one was built in Tuapayo to connect Lorong 2 to the station. Subsequently, the view was basically that if we built a connection, the businesses that benefited from these connections should pay for the underpass. So in Orchard Road, for instance, rather than building an underpass across during the construction of the station, when it would have been easy, we had expected, the MRT Corporation, had expected for CK Tang to pay for it. When they eventually said they couldn't pay, we ended up having to build it at about double the cost, because by that time the construction was nearly finished. So, of course, equally had hard fights to have the underpasses built, particularly at Raffles Place and here at Tanjong Pagar. I did eventually succeed, and we have the station there, the underpass. However, if you look at it, particularly the picture there in the center, you see that we only have an escalator up and no escalator down. And in fact, that is something that I find even today, that at a lot of places where you have escalators, it's escalator up only. Just now I came on the MRT and there was an escalator was out of service, or rather I went, there was an escalator out of service at Bugis where I changed from the bus. And so only the up escalator is working. Actually, I don't understand why the people do not realize that for elderly like myself, it's just as difficult or more difficult to go down the stairs than to go up the stairs. And there's a question whether if you have only one escalator, should it go up or down? Anyway, there are some other pedestrian issues like jaywalking. One day there was an article in the Strange Times about jaywalking that caught my attention. The #1 spot was at Jalan Yunus, clearly created by passengers going from the bus stop to the MRT station. So I mentioned the situation in a keynote speech at a conference in Brisbane. And again, the then minister, Mr. Raymond Lim, showed a keen interest in my speech and promptly followed up. So we now have a direct pedestrian crossing, whereas previously there was a three-legged crossing. So my point is actually that jaywalking was caused by design. but it also reminded me, actually, when I was a student at Berkeley, and I did some part-time work for a traffic engineer in Richmond, the next town. At one day, the police chief came by and said, look, I want you guys to study. I have a lot of police officers that do nothing all day long, and then they write a few citations at a particular place. And I want you to go and study why it is that people make left turns there that are not allowed. And so we discovered eventually that anybody that made a left turn there avoided about a 5-mile detour to go where they wanted to go. So quite clearly, it was by design that people violated the rules, just like this jaywalking spot that, well, so much about jaywalking. Three-legged crossings seem to be very popular in Singapore. There are many examples where you're supposed to walk this way rather than straight across. And these two examples here in the central area where you would expect the emphasis to be on pedestrians, because in the central area, you know, even if people come there by car or public transport around lunchtime and during the various times of the day, so here this is not allowed for pedestrians, and then here is not allowed for pedestrians. So people have to go around 3 legs when it's in fact obvious that you could go on the shortest path. But perhaps the worst case actually of pedestrian crossings is the removal of the one at the Patterson Road, the extension of Orchard Road. And that one actually causes a substantial detour for people that have a baby stroller or are in a wheelchair. There are signs there that tell you, you know, to go up to Orchard Boulevard across. The real thing of that particular situation is that when I actually asked and had a discussion that was arranged by the Prime Minister's office about the benefits to car users, it turns out that there are 0 benefits, because the cars that used to have to wait for pedestrians to cross Patterson Road, that soon make the right turn into Patterson Road, they now zoom only to wait the same amount of time at Orchard Road, because the 2 signals are, of course, coordinated. So there's really no benefit at all, but of course pedestrians have been substantially inconvenienced. Okay, this is a different story here. This is a pedestrian crossing, very extensive, very long walk, to say the least, I think it's actually Jalan Yunus or Yunus Link, I believe, is the correct name. And really, when you're up there, you look in either direction, there's no car coming. So, because the lights at the 2 ends of the approach are, of course, coordinated. And so there's big gaps in the traffic which could have easily been used for a pedestrian actuated signalized crossing. It would have probably cost 1% of the cars to have to stop, if that many. So, you know, why have such an elaborate crossing for when it's not necessary? Here we're talking about the lack of at-grade pedestrian crossing. At this particular intersection in my neighborhood, at the end of Marine Parade Road with Bedok South Road, there is, as you can see back there, there's a pedestrian crossing there. And so everybody that wants to get across is expected to use the pedestrian overhead bridge. whether they're elderly, physically challenged, or people with strollers, that's where they expect to cross. Even though traffic in one of the directions, in the northbound direction, is stopped when the stoning traffic is allowed to go. So there's a safe crossing here, but in the opposite direction, sorry. In the opposite direction here, there is no stoppage of traffic, even though the two flows are roughly equal. So it wouldn't really affect the capacity of the road. So again, and I noticed this because at one time I saw a lady with a stroller running across, trying to catch a gap. So why? Why, when there is already traffic light there that could be used when pedestrians need to cross in a synchronized way? This one, of course, is in the Suntec area. You're probably all maybe familiar with this. Okay. This is a crossing here that even here, the sign actually, at one time, I think it's been taken down, but the sign actually suggested that people should go into the shopping center to go across the street. Even though there's a bus stop just down the road here, about maybe 20 meters or so. And clearly people coming from the bus stop would need to come across here. Probably late at night when the shopping center is closed, they still need to get across if they want to go wherever it is they're going. But here there are no markings. And I suspect that there are no markings to make sure that anybody wanting to cross will not do so when a car is approaching. In other words, we always give priority to cars. That's the only reason I can imagine, because there actually are there are gaps in the fences, and that there is a provision, a walkway across the median. So it's clearly known to LTA, for instance, that people walk across there, but to mark the crossing so that pedestrians have some kind of maybe a little more security is not there. Well, this is a picture that I caught at a overhead pedestrian bridge. We have a rapidly aging population in Singapore. And clearly, some people find it very difficult to go down the stairs on overhead bridges, right? As you can see in this picture. And with the aging population growing, there may be fewer and fewer hands available in the future to help them navigate the obstacles that have been created, all in order to facilitate vehicle movements. So my message is, Singapore needs a new and different approach. What has become a city of cars needs to be put back to the people. Singapore might consider to adopt the Swiss practice, where all the road space is to be shared equally between vehicles and people. It's very exceptional. I cannot think of an overhead pedestrian bridge in Switzerland. There are a few underpasses, but mainly actually where they make sense, where they lead to a lower level straight of activity. But at signalized intersections, pedestrians have equal rights with motor vehicles, and they are given sufficient time to cross, and always along the shortest path. So Singapore might think about doing something similar. I think one of the things that might be useful is to establish a committee of planners and engineers that with the task to review existing intersections, existing pedestrian crossings, other areas where pedestrians are active, and establish the best solution. Of course, the committee needs to have clear rules, and these should reflect the needs of the aging population, and it should reflect the priority for people over vehicles rather than, you know, the other way around, which what we have today. This, when you, I mean, there are many data sources where you can readily find critical pedestrian areas. For instance, if you look at the EasyLink database and you look at the, say, the top 200 bus to rail transfers that are not straight vertical like in Woodlands, but where the interchange maybe or the bus stops are some distance away, you could look at probably the 200 busiest bus stop to see how people get there. There are, of course, other areas, and there should definitely be a review of what currently exists in terms of overhead bridges. Are they really necessary? I mean, and there are other sort of little obstacles here and there. For instance, in our neighborhood, there's one street where pedestrians cannot go straight along across the side street. They must go about 8 meters or 10 meters up into the road before they're allowed to cross. There's a railing there to stop them from going straight across. I'm not sure what the purpose is other than making it easier for cars to move. And this is the kind of thing that I think needs to be looked at and needs to be reevaluated. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. How many of you are pedestrians? How many motorists? So obviously you outweigh the motorists. Now, of course, Mr. Bruno has told us some locations where things can improve. I agree with that. Now, let's go to what Singapore was in the 1950s and 60s. We look at it, footpaths were almost non-existent. Some of you are not born. I know some of them. This is the one near the convent, and that is the multi-story car park, no more there. So these are some of the photographs I took from the old PW reports. Now this is even worse. This is how people cross. Now I think nowadays you don't find that unless they want to do so. Maybe there may be some areas, but generally there are much more facilities. In those days, they do this because they have no choice. So what happened? In 1976, a long time ago, 40 years ago, the pedestrian accidents hit an all-time high of 132. And then the government got very concerned. So those days, the Public Works Department, which is now part of the LTA, and the traffic police says, this won't do. We can't, at that time we were about 2 million people, and we lose so many people in a year was really bad. So we came up with two different things. One was the police came up with the pedestrian crossing rules, all right? Anti-jaywalking. At the same time, there was the concerted effort to improve pedestrian facilities. So you found, the first thing was to upgrade all the 5-foot ways. The 5-foot ways are typical in Singapore, right? Where you have the 5-foot way next to the shop houses. So the first thing was to upgrade all of them, tile them up, and sometimes make them without steps and so on. And also, so this was the first thing, to upgrade all the 5-foot ways. Secondly, it was decided to provide footpaths for all new roads. There may be some old roads in Singapore without footpaths, but I think almost all of them have footpaths today, which means you don't need people to walk on the roads. Then we started with this, you have seen this famous sign, the anti-jaywalking sign, which says you cannot cross within 50 meters on each side if there is a crossing. So this was the police rules. And that needed us to provide a lot of facilities. So we had crossings. The zebras came along, quite well observed in Singapore, right? We had the green man, red man that came along. And then we had, of course, the famous turning traffic giveaway to pedestrians. That was one of the best systems. One of the best things we ever introduced in Singapore was to make turning traffic giveaway to pedestrians at junctions. And with that, every junction became a pedestrian crossing. Yeah, there are some cases where there are three-step crossing and so on, yes. But I would say the majority of them have the four of them. There may be a few of them. Then, of course, something that we are not very proud of, a lot of pedestrian bridges. We built about 400 of them. And some of them are, like Mr. Bruno says, white elephants. It is 5.4 meters high, which means about 38 steps. And a lot of people have problem using these steps. So maybe we went too quickly on overhead bridges. And then, of course, underpasses started, of course, when the MRT started. And after that, they cost much more. Probably you don't need to go so deep, so they're more popular, except that at night, people do not use them because there's some fear of using in areas where there are not much people. Then recently, we even protect the pedestrians with covered walkways, make them much more comfortable. And then pedestrian malls, all right, started in 1970s, Orchard, there's Kampong Glam, and places like Emerald Hill Road. Now, what is the result? This speaks for itself, all right? Whatever you say about Singapore's system, this speaks for itself. We brought down the pedestrian accident from 132 to 47 today, right? And it was a result of traffic police work, the LTA's work, road safety council's work, education, engineering, engagement, enforcement, and emergency services. So whatever I say about Singapore, we can say things have improved. That shows for itself. The only problem is that now at 47, there are 28 elderly pedestrians. That's a problem. I think Mr. Bruno brought it up, that we have a problem with elderly pedestrians. Almost more than half of them are elderly pedestrians. And what are their fears? We interviewed them. These are the fears of elderly pedestrians. Number one is they're afraid of falling down. Number two, they're afraid of being involved in traffic accidents. And finally, of getting lost. And at this moment, I think LTA and the police are resolving these issues on how to improve the lot for the elderly pedestrians. People are getting old, of course. So am I. So we started using bridges, all right, escalators. Now there are lifts, and even the long, that's a very long one, not very nice to use. But I think the ramps are not popular. It takes much more longer time to cross the ramp than the bridge itself. And there's one that is at I think, National NUH. And then at NUH, you've got nice ramps. And people say we are sick. When we go, we get even sicker because it takes so long to cross. Then, of course, this one is a good system whereby we give much more green time to the elderly pedestrian by using his special card. Of course, Mr. Bruno Wildermuth very much involved in that card, in that fare card. And, in the beginning, a lot of people thought they have to pay for it. So I think now there's a sign which says no payment. If you look at that, you can look at it. It says no payment. So they didn't. Now, okay, I think they. Anyway, that is my photo. I'm a senior citizen, okay. Now, I think LTA started this wonderful scheme, Silver Zone, with I think, police, and it seems to be working. Still can improve, but I think it is working in some sense. Now, of course, let me tell what can we do. I do not claim that we got the best thing. We have many things to do, as Mr. Bruno Wildermuth says, that some of them, I think, firstly, our overhead bridges are very unfriendly. So I think we need to put lifts on all of them. If we can put lifts at all floors of HDB buildings, I do not see why we cannot put lifts on all our bridges over the few years. It's expensive, but we can do that. The second thing, do we need slip roads in the city? A slip road is to allow the car or the vehicle to travel fast. Now, I have no problem with having slip roads outside the city on the express space, but do we need them in the city? Because they are irritant to the pedestrians, especially with cyclists using them, even more dangerous. So I would propose that we close the slip road, let the cars and vehicles go through the junction in the city area. Not everywhere, but in the city area. Next one is, now we have problems crossing junctions that are unsignalized. I mean, it's not, this one is okay, Carpenter Street, I think. But generally, there's nothing here. So when you come over here, there's no traffic light, you got to give way to the vehicle. So why not put at all junctions have zebra crossings? Let the cars wait when they turn, right? And that will mean people can walk without being interrupted. Of course, it'll delay the vehicles, turning vehicles and vehicles coming out, but it'll definitely improve pedestrian safety and pedestrian continuity. They can walk without being hindered. Now, the scramble crossing, we have one at Lau Pa Sat, all right? Now, in town centers and city area, I think we should do this, where we stop all traffic and let pedestrians cross. We should do that. I think that only at town centers, city areas, instead of turning traffic give way, let us do so-called scramble crossing, where everyone stops, people walk across. We have one in Singapore, that's at Lau Pa Sat. People are not aware of it. That's New Zealand, that is Tokyo. Now, car-free, let us reclaim spaces, all right? That's how it goes for car-free. I don't even want to go straight that way, but we are somewhere here now. We are having car-free days. We're having traffic calming. So let us move more towards giving pedestrians more priority. So we have this car-free Sunday, but somehow bicycles took over, not pedestrians. That's the trouble. Right, nothing, but we have to change that. So let us start moving towards that. Now, reclaiming spaces coming, all right? Bencoolen Street, we have closed 2 lanes, all right? We have also the new Tengah New Town, going to be friendly. So let us do that. Now, I'll talk about this one a little bit. I hope you all can talk about this one. Should we pedestrianize Orchard Road? I think I will leave that to you all to discuss. I think it's a very important issue. Today, Orchard Road has 3 functions. It's a main road to the city, it's a commercial street, and it also gives access. So how do we treat buses? How do we provide alternatives if you close Orchard Road to pedestrians? And this is something that has been talked about since the 1990s. We're still talking about it. And I think it's something that needs some attention because it will really make the place very lively. But what are the trade-offs? That's the important thing. And I hope later during the Q&A, you will participate in discussing this. Now, there's a precedent. Raffles Place was full of traffic. In 1972, none of you, somebody not born yet, I was involved in this scheme. We converted the car park, underground car park that was there, into a pedestrian mall. A lot of hullabaloo, a lot of crying. Ultimately, they're all happy. There was Robinson's here those days. There was Wideaway's, all right, Gensing's. All the major shopping centers were along Raffles Place. And we did convert it into pedestrian mall. Okay, so it is possible, but needs a lot of work. So ultimately, let us do this. At the moment, I think, unfortunately, we have really put the car at the center, all right? Let us put the pedestrian at the center, and you find definitely, all right, things will improve and make Singapore even more pedestrian-friendly. I would not agree that it's not pedestrian-friendly today, but I can make it definitely much more friendly. Thank you.
Maybe I would like to ask the first question, and either of you may feel free to take the question. We're talking about pedestrian-friendly, right? So let's unpack it a little bit. What do we really mean? There are a couple of dimensions we talked about. I think both in your slides talk about safety, right? And we talked about perhaps convenience for the pedestrians. And then lastly, maybe comfort, right? In Singapore's rather inclement weather. So what are the elements we are missing I know one common thread in your presentation is mobility for the elderly, and I think we'll talk about that. Orchard Road, definitely we'll talk about that with Stephen here from OBA. We have to talk about it. And Menon has set us up quite nicely for that. But any views on the dimensions? Because safety sometimes is a function of the design, right? As you pointed out, what is the role of government in providing the infra to enhance safety? What is the pedestrian's role in looking after his own safety? What is the enforcement role in safety? If you talk about convenience, then we're talking about porosity, we're talking about whether people can access crossings easily without going through vertical integration. And comfort, you know. So are there any other dimensions that that somehow we've missed, especially in future-proofing the transport system going forward for increasingly aging population?
Well, I think the pedestrian is the most unfriendly of all people, most uncooperative. Don't you agree? I think all of us are uncooperative. We always want the shortest path to cross the road. We try to minimize travel time. It's natural. I mean, none of us want to spend time. And very often the most convenient path is not the safest path. And I think what is needed now to make the two together, and it's not so easy. When you are an engineer on site, you know it's not so easy to make the most convenient path the safest path. And that's where the problem lies. That's where the problem lies, that we are not able to do it everywhere. A lot of places we can do, but not everywhere.
I take a somewhat different view in the sense that the pedestrians obviously move themselves with their own power. Everybody else in a vehicle has a motor that moves them. So therefore, if the pedestrian should have the priority where possible, because the pedestrian moves on his own power, and that should be reflected in the priority that we give to different movements.
Do you agree with sort of a paradigm diagram that we put up there? Is there something that you would change about it? This is something that we have obviously gone through some thought internally. I think this has been discussed in the civil service among the land use agencies and also the transportation agencies. This is something we thought we'll move into. Before I open the floor for questions, is there any view that you would take on this? Is that the right way we should go? Is that the paradigm we should be aiming for? I would tell you as a transport planner, the sort of internal tension that we have is between public transport. It's no longer with cars. I think cars, we have relegated it in our minds quite a bit in LTA. But it's between public transport and walking and cycling, because a lot of public transport today still is road-based, i.e. you still have the buses. So when you talk about giving priority, unless it's priority to buses, there's a way that you have to work the system so that the trade-offs are manageable. Because when we look at transporting people, we also need to look at the bus speeds and all that. Otherwise, bus commuters will also complain that I'm taking so long, giving way to fellow pedestrians who are crossing the street. So therein lies a bit of sometimes the transport persons or planners' dilemma. I'm sure, Menon, you understand. A lot of it is road-based, and we have, over the last 5 years, we've injected 1,000 buses into the system. So it's not a small number, but we have to rebalance that against the bigger picture of trying to go car light and also trying to promote walking and cycling. So that's what we're up against. I suppose it's all a matter of balancing it and getting the balance right. Any views on the paradigm that we're moving in?
Well, I mean, you're right in the sense of public transport needs to also get its priority, but I think from all the examples that I'm aware of, I am not aware where buses in particular have been in any way impacted by giving more direct access to, for instance, the two intersections in the central area that I used where pedestrians are forced Threelegged way. There are no buses making those favored turns. Similarly, at that jaywalking spot that Jalan Yunus, that didn't affect buses at all. So I'm not sure that we need to worry too much about, looking out for the buses. By and large, it's other vehicles that have been favored over people.
I don't see anything wrong with that. I think I agree with him that buses need not be really affected too much by pedestrian priority. So we should give them more priority.
I suppose later on when we talk about Orchard Road pedestrianization, there we'll see the trade-offs a bit more acutely because 22 services run along Orchard Road. So the question is, you quite rightly pointed out, it's one of the arterial roads, right? You have Bukit Timah, you have Orchard Road, and you have River Valley. Basically, the three parallel roads. So something's got to give, right? In terms of where the buses go. And so that's one of the dilemmas why we're still talking about it, right? But there's some action, right? And I think I'm optimistic that we will progressively see a reduction of roads. Not quite ready for Orchard Road yet, but maybe Orchard Road will come. But I thought I'll just, anything?
No, I wanted to point out that you mentioned the 22 bus routes in Orchard Road.
Right.
There was a study of the bus services, and they found that Orchard Road, because it has so many services in there, was actually one of the lowest utilized bus sections in Singapore, because there are too many bus routes going through there. So I think, it's a bit dangerous to use the 22 routes as... I
agree. So we need to look at the loading factor. We need to look at whether it can be rationalized, especially when we're putting in more train lines. Like Thomson East Coast Line will have a station there. And that actually sets the staging plan for us to look at it holistically and rebalance the trade-offs.
Singapore leads the world in a lot of economic and hard metrics, as we know. But Wikipedia tells me that Singapore is only 94th in terms of car ownership. So quite low. My country, New Zealand, is 8th in terms of car ownership, even though we're small. I guess my point is to understand why, with such very low car ownership, clearly Singapore's transport policy has so strongly prioritised the car, because of course if we're trying to turn things around, as you are with the paradigm shift, we have to understand why we got to this. Clearly the transport policy has massively prioritised cars. So I'm just interested in a bit of a retrospective about why the policy has driven cars so strongly, given how low you are in terms of ownership.
When it comes to vehicle policy, we didn't get to where we were instantly. There were a series of both ownership and usage measures which we kicked in. I think there was a time where we could have, in my opinion, gone further in terms of curbing vehicle ownership. We didn't take that decision for quite a few cycles. We were behind the curve. In my view, we could have gone to, we are at 0.25% growth in terms of vehicle ownership. We could have gone there much earlier. We could have gone there maybe, in my estimation, 9 years ago, but we didn't. And we stayed at 3% for some time. I won't elaborate on the reasons, but there was, as usual, a series of trade-offs. Then vehicle usage is another one, whereby we are quite infamous for our electronic road pricing. Whether we could have been stiffer in terms of the usage charges is a question, a fair one, because with every beep of your IU, your in-vehicle unit, the political temperature rises for motorists. So the question is, at which stage do you balance that? And I think decisively, over the last 5 years, we have moved quite deliberately into quite close to a vehicle zero growth policy. We are reaching there. I think in the next review, we will be there. That means basically you're depending on recycled stock for your vehicle ownership. And usage, I think together with car park measures that we will be implementing quite aggressively, that will really haul back the vehicle trips from being generated. But building of car parks itself is a trip generator. Whenever you build car parks, you tend to generate the use of the cars. So with the expanded public transport system, I think that's something that we would we would push very aggressively for, and indeed we are doing that. And that will cause the modal shift in terms of public transport to grow quite aggressively. We're at 67% today, so I think we'll hit 70% quite soon, because this year we are rolling out 2 lines, the Tuas West extension. That one is slightly lower in loading, but once we open Downtown Line 3 in October, that one parallels the East-West line. I think that loading will shoot up as well, together with stages 1 and 2. So both on the push and pull front, we could have done better, I would say. That's why it's counterintuitive why Singapore is such stringent and then we're not there. So it's in the execution. It's not in the conception of the levers, it's in the execution of the levers that somehow we are not as aggressive. And all that, land transport is sometimes tied into the politics of the day and what we can wear politically. I'll be the first one to say so. So some of these has, encountered some of the backlashes and the pushbacks from the society.
Well, but we should not overlook one point, and that is, yes, car ownership in Singapore is relatively low. And for instance, in my comparison between Singapore and Switzerland, there's a big difference. But what must be understood, the car usage in Singapore is the highest in the world. The amount of travel per car is much, much higher than anywhere else in the world. Of course, it's understandable in a sense when you look at the high cost of a car because of the COE. But at the same time, I'm sure, and from my own personal experience, there are many, many trips that are not necessary, but people basically have the philosophy, I have a car, I paid for it, I may as well use it to the maximum. And this is where I had proposed some time ago in a commentary at NUSS 2 years ago or so, that perhaps the COE should also have another aspect to it, is the amount of mileage you generate. And there should be different charges for generating high mileage. And I'm sure that would help to convince people that, hey, maybe I don't really need to use the car. I mean, I have neighbors that ask me, why are you taking the bus when you go down? Yeah, I go down 5 bus stops to do shopping. And 9 out of 10 times, unless I know I bring a huge amount of things back, I go by bus. But my neighbors say, you got a car, why do you go by bus? So that's another aspect that we need to look at.
If you look at it, there's 1 car for 3 families in Singapore, roughly. It's quite a high, 1 to 9. Well, sorry, 3 families, 1 car, right? And there's a pride of ownership. You can't say it's not. If you look at the Saturday newspapers, there's a whole section in the advertisement telling you why it's nice to have a car. It's more of a lifestyle. I don't think many of us getting a car. It's more of a lifestyle that without a car you are deprived of something. And unless something is done, every Saturday, I think it's about 20 pages of telling you why you should own a car. So some of these things are really working against. One of them, like Bruno says, is that people with a car, they use it as much as possible. Number 2 is these advertisements are really working against us.
Yeah, so the sunk cost effect is sometimes to blame for that. But yeah, mileage-based COE is something that is still tossing in our heads, how to implement it. It is effective. That's why for Singapore, I think we need both. We need the high cost of ownership, and we need aggressive usage charges, and we need car parking measures. That's very important. So we are tightening the standards even as we speak. Hopefully that will shift behavior as well.
My name is King Liang. I'm from GJH Private Limited. I would like to share with you my experience in Japan one of these days. I actually had a self-drive with my wife in Hokkaido just a couple of months back. So we went to the car rentals companies and we wanted to rent a car. So as normal Singaporeans, we always wanted to get a maximum coverage of insurance. And interestingly, the rental company told us, no need to worry, our accidents rates is very, very low. and most of the accidents occur in the car park. More than 50% of the accidents actually occur in the car parks and not on the road. So as we drive along, probably you get the understanding because people give ways and there's no jaywalking, things like that. So I get very impressed. And incidentally, or interestingly, 2 months back, I also attended a session by CLC on about indiscriminate throwing of rubbish in the public spaces. And there's a lot of arguments about whether to provide more dustbins and things like that in the public area. So interesting enough, when I was in Japan, again, the same place, I could hardly find any dustbin. No dustbin at all in the public space, in a shopping mall. When I have something, I couldn't even, I had to keep it in my pocket, so to speak. So the question is the same thing I want to drive across. It's not so much about providing hardwares. It's not so much about giving more, building more pedestrian bridge, more separators between pedestrian walk and car. I think a lot to do with probably public educations. And I think it's a lot, I mean, Japan's a very unique species of people. But I was thinking that it's all about values, about cultural values, about social norms, and things like that. Not fines, not rules and regulations, but public educations that we can inculcate such values in our young, in people like that. And probably that will help to promote pedestrian safeties. So it's just a statement that probably you can help me to elaborate and see whether there's a truth in what I said. Thank you.
Certainly, I don't know about the speakers. I'll hand it over to them to respond. But certainly, well, I won't say in lieu of infrastructure provision. I would say in addition to it, public education is important. Japan, not sure which city, if it's Hokkaido or Fukuoka. Most cities in Japan have good infrastructure already, and then built on top of that, many years of very strong culture of conscientiousness, consideration for your fellow neighbor. Ladies would wrap up their rubbish into a tissue paper, put it in their bag, and then go home and dispose it. We dispose of it. So it's that kind of a culture that we have. But I fully agree with you. In fact, for walking and cycling, when we have to share a path, right, cyclists and pedestrians alike, that's where I fully agree that we need to create a norm. It's not about my guys in yellow going out to enforce. We have these guys that are decked out in yellow with black khaki shorts that go and summon people for wrong use of device on wrong path. I mean, initially that is the case, but certainly I don't want to be doing this in 40 years' time. I think it's also a signal that Singapore has not progressed much as a society where we can't even share something. Everything has got to be dedicated. Dedicated path for you, dedicated path for me. I mean, Singapore is finite, right? So we can't be dedicating every space. So what are your views on common space and public education, graciousness, norming?
I think it's not for lack of trying. If you look at Singapore Road Safety Council, how much effort they put in with the traffic police to educate the public that everyone is responsible for their own safety, that every life matters. All primary 4 school children, I think most of us did, go through the road safety park. They spend a day there to get the essentials of what is proper usage of the roads. So it's not for lack of trying, it's more the culture. The question is, how do you really keep on impressing upon them that, that it's not just one session, that you are responsible for your own safety and for safety of others. That is the difficult part. That is the only success that we can think of.
Well, my observation when you particularly refer to Japan, which actually is surprisingly one of the high bicycling usage nations, despite it's seldom mentioned. Usually it's the European cities, Copenhagen, the Dutch cities that are well known for bicycling. But the standard rule in those countries with the high usage is, of course, there's a strict sort of level in terms of who has priorities. In the bicycling nations, pedestrians clearly have the priority over the bicyclists, And of course, bicyclists have priority over cars. And so that's the way it works. And this is something that we haven't really introduced in Singapore yet. I mean, we're talking about sharing, and I experience it quite often. I mean, I do like to bicycle when I'm in Singapore, but I wouldn't dare to use the road with my bicycle, and I find it even difficult, you know, using sidewalks because I find many cyclists that really don't pay much attention to, you know, who has priority. And they think they have priority because they can move faster than pedestrians. So that's something clearly we have to instill in our population, that there should be a recognition that, you know, who should give priority to the other group.
Mr. Bruno just now pointed out in your lecture that in Singapore we do have some cases of jaywalking. Some instances they are more serious than the others. But in Singapore, I realized that we have three important areas that we look at when we tackle this problem of jaywalking. The first one is infrastructure. So it talks about the provision, the availability, as well as the design of the infrastructure at site. And where the site does not allow, the second point comes in, which is enforcement. How the police actually make sure that people do not jaywalk at places that are unsafe for them. The third one will be public education, to make sure that the young are inculcated from a young age to know that jaywalking is very unsafe, and in many instances, people have lost their lives when they jaywalk. But among these three, infrastructure, enforcement, and education, there has to be something that is more important than the others, right? So in your opinion, which one is the more important one that we should focus on, and why?
I always remember my version is the 3 E's: engineering, which is design, enforcement, and education. So the question is, from Sarah, what kind of balance do we strike within these three for now, for Singapore to move it forward?
Well, I add one more: engagement, right? You engage with the community. I look at it actually, enforcement should be the last one. Although it's important, the stick should be the last one. Now, without infrastructure, engineering, you can't really tell people to not to jaywalk. There's nothing for them to do. So I would say education is still important, very important, I think, if you ask me. Then be infrastructure and ultimately enforcement. That should be last.
Well, I think, as I indicated in my talk, actually, that jaywalking spot on Jalan Yunus, of course, was created by design. I mean, if you are having a very heavy movement of people going from a bus stop to the MRT, and you expect them to go any other way than the shortest path, then that's a basic design flaw. I mean, we've learned that, like I mentioned earlier, that situation in Clementi, where people forced their way along the shortest path, regardless what HDB thought where they should walk, and then, you know, you have to expect that, particularly when you have a large number of people, that they do expect to have a path that is efficient and the shortest path. So if we design facilities in any other way, we have to expect that some people will jaywalk, depending on, you know, what the situation is.
You have not discussed about the current trend toward this motorized, specifically you can bring the vehicles with you and travel.
That is a form of mobility. I think gentleman was talking about personalized mobility devices. We call them PMDs for short. Yeah, so they're causing us quite a lot of sleep recently because they are fairly mobile. And it's going to be increasingly a trend. So even for PMDs, we have, as a matter of policy, allowed them to be carried on the buses and trains, because we acknowledge these things are, you know, something which people can carry along, and they won't take up too much space in the public transport modes, and they provide the first and last mile. As to what are the safety aspects and the right use of them, we have been rather permissive in allowing them to be used on footpaths, right? The only place that they can't go is the road carriage. We had a picture in the Straits Times. Did you see the guy going on the KPE? Yeah, so when I woke up in the morning, my first email was to my traffic engineer. I said, did we catch the guy on camera? You know, because traffic cameras, then the answer to me was he wasn't exceeding 70 kilometers per hour. That was the joke of the day, lah. But anyway, it's not so much to catch him, but it's to, you know, it's actually for their own sake. Because when you want to, you know about differential, speed differential, right? When you're up against a vehicle traveling at 80, 90 kilometers and you are traveling at 40, the speed differential will cause accidents, the wider it is. And that's basic transport 101. So the danger is when you're not equipped to interact with road carriage vehicles. You will argue for bicycles, that's the same, but at least bicycles have been around, right? People know how to, because especially bicycles, they go at a certain speed. But PMDs today, we're not quite sure of this animal because it can go fast, go slow. So I think motorists have a harder time to navigate or to interact with the PMD, especially on a fast-flowing expressway. So we were concerned not to pin the guy down, but to say let's deter others from using it. But then if you deter them, then where are they going to use it? Basically, we tried to free up the footpaths, free up the cycling lanes, they can use it. And Bruno, I fully agree with you, we need to move faster. Currently it's not good enough. So we are in a quite aggressive plan to try and roll out together with the park connectors 700 kilometers of dedicated cycling lane. It can be used for PMDs. Anybody else struggling with PMDs? Any views on a personal mobility device? It's part of the new mobility, like it or not?
I'm a cyclist and I cycle along the footpaths as well as the PCNs. I would suggest that the users of these PMDs, they are the new animals in the concrete jungle. So I still do not know how to handle them because they go much faster, battery powered. Because my bicycle, I use my legs, you see. But yeah, most of these mobility devices are, when you call something a device, I think it's battery powered. Yeah. And they tend to go about double my speed. So I dread to think of what would happen if they just slam into me. It's a new animal in the concrete jungle. Is that the right way of? So you need to address that because this animal can cause a lot of damage.
So for that reason, I think we've put some speed restrictions on the use of, let's say, footpaths and shared paths. I think it's 15 kilometers per hour. So the next question is, how do you enforce that? So my guys in yellow got speed laser gun, you know, shoot and then determine the speed. You know, so, but I mean, where does it end? Basically, I agree, it's a new animal, it's here to stay. But basically, if we're going to pour resources into only enforcing, I think it's a big problem. So I agree with my colleague that the 3 E's are important. The engineering of it, the provision of, where possible, try and segregate them. Don't go on the carriageway because you're causing trouble. Educate them aggressively, you know, and say when you are using footpaths, you're a new animal, go at the speed where people can predict your behavior. That's 15 kilometers, almost like a cyclist going on the track. So I think we've tried to put a structure around it. This is the new mobility, you know. It's still evolving. But these are the things that we have to grapple with, right? But we're slowly going from pedestrianization to PMDs and cyclists, no? So I want to rein it back a bit, right? So if you don't mind, can we do Orchard Road? All right, so otherwise, Stephen's time here will be, you know, Oba and Orchard Road. So he's all equipped to ask the Orchard Road question, really. Thank you.
I don't think I want to ask Orchard Road pedestrianization problem, but I have a low-hanging fruits for you to consider. It has been 8 years since Patterson Junction was closed, and Iron Orchard is celebrating its 8 years anniversary, and it's a very successful shopping mall. But you can see all the activity is all lying in the basement because of the way the underpass was designed. So I want to understand what is the latest thinking of LTA in regard to Patterson Junction. Is there a possibility to work with LTA together to restudy again and perhaps reopen the pedestrian junction? Thank you.
Well, as I've indicated, actually, at the meeting that was actually arranged through the Prime Minister's office, the people of LTA had to admit that there was no real benefit to vehicles turning at that intersection. So I don't really see much point. I mean, the only other point could be possible that there might have been some accidents. I really haven't, I'm not aware that any accidents happened at that pedestrian crossing. But really, from the benefits to vehicles, there are none, because they just end up spending the same amount of time waiting, whereas previously they waited for pedestrians, and by the time they reached the Orchard Boulevard, traffic light probably turned green. So it should be fairly straightforward matter, actually, to reconsider. But of course, it may be difficult for LTA to admit that they've made a mistake, and you know.
Actually, it's not a low-hanging fruit. It's quite a lofty one, because the reason why I say that is because, probably unknown to Bruno, there were some explicit views expressed about that junction, and this came from very high up. So I think the general view is that that junction is a junction that is set up for pedestrian and vehicular conflict, because many cycles, if you remember the old pedestrian junction, now, of course, Louis Vuitton complains, nobody walk in front of my shop, right? And everybody is forced to go underground. But don't forget, the footfall underground, wow, they are blessed to the, blessed out of their hearts, because they really enjoy the business that's been driven underground. So somebody in the equation benefits. But question is whether from a traffic point of view, we can afford it. The views are conflicted. Some agree, some say that it's not just the right turning traffic into Orchard from Patterson, it's the straight going traffic that now is freed up, because basically if you drive down Patterson, right to Newton, now it's a bit of a breeze down to Orchard. Yeah, but then you ask me, then what are you talking about, being pedestrian friendly where you're talking about cars? Again, I would say it's a case where we have to balance the trade-offs. There are some buses that turn right from Patterson that turn right. There are buses that come down and turn left. There are buses that come down from Newton and turn left. There are buses that go straight from Orchard Road, and there are some buses that turn right from Patterson. I think it's a good split between the 22 services. Question is whether we need 22. I think that's the issue. So low-hanging fruit, I'm not so sure. Whether we can rethink, yes. I think LTA has reached a point where we're open to rethink anything, right? Because car light means that you revisit, right, all the issues. So I'm quite sure we are prepared to relook at the operating environment, relook at the strategy, relook at what it means to be car light, what it means to be pedestrian friendly, without looking at whether Louis Vuitton suffers or not, or Oba is happy. It's just a question of looking at all the trade-offs, and I know that you come under a lot of heat, but underground, ask those fellas who are blessed out their socks. I mean, they'll tell you a different story. We've driven a lot of business underground, and Wheelock and company is really thriving. So Bruno, I know you have something exciting to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that I'm sure many of you have been to Paris. You've been on the Champs-Élysées. Did anybody find an underpass at the Champs-Élysées? Or in Zurich at the Bahnhofstrasse? Or in many other European cities that have major shopping streets? I would really be interested to hear if somebody knows of one. But why do we need to send pedestrians to cross Orchard Road underground? I mean, really, ask yourself.
I did use Patterson Junction when it was still a road. I was a student, I was working part-time on Orchard Road, so I had to cross it. And it was true, it was really, we didn't really have a lot of time to cross. There were a lot of people crossing, and the traffic they were very impatient. But I think further up now, in where Orchard Building is the same situation. There's that crossing between Orchard Building and I suppose Mandarin Gallery. That crossing has become the old Patterson Road. I think people are very impatient with pedestrians crossing there, and I think we just don't have enough time to cross there. I don't know if we're just pushing the traffic up further up the road. I don't know, is there any view from LT or the panelists about that particular, congestion?
I think I can speak for the panelists that if I can echo Bruno, probably he'll say, just let the cars wait, or don't have underground, don't repeat the same mistake as we did at Patterson. So I think it's a question of looking at it again. I fully agree with you. And would you agree? I didn't get your name, sorry, but would you agree to reinstate that crossing? Yeah, now. Because you were traumatized by it with the vehicles waiting for you.
I'm personally very used to the area, so I know how to navigate the underground. But whenever friends and Singaporeans come back to Singapore, I think they always get lost. They try to avoid the area, and maybe it's a matter of getting used to. I'm not sure.
You raised another point about wayfinding as well. It's a secondary point. But thanks for that question. I think you've caused me to pause certainly and revisit. As we will. Nothing is off review nowadays, right? So I would gladly say that. Orchard Road itself, pedestrianization, any views? You go there for shopping, your parents go there, yeah. How come we keep going back to Patterson?
I just want you to tell us, many years ago, there was some thinking about redoing Orchard Road so that people can walk on a second level, aircon, linking all the building together. What is happening to that plan?
Any URA MND colleague would like to answer that? Okay, there's only one level crossing Orchard Gateway that goes, wow, very iconic one, go across. The rest of Orchard Road, I think, second level crossing, well, there's always the urban blight argument. I'm not so sure. I'm not so convinced myself. I'm not so sure our urban planners are convinced that we need second level crossing Orchard Road. I think if my preference, if we were not to give motorists priority, I'd rather pedestrianize it. It is a better option than building another level. I think bringing the pedestrians back, reclaiming the space. But I want to hear views about the reclaiming of the space. Is it just reclaiming for reclaiming's sake? Do we need programming? How do we sustain it? Otherwise, it's nothing worse than motorists who drive past and then saying that space is empty, And then worst part, your retail doesn't pick up also because of that, So it's a lose-lose. So we must, when we close Orchard Road, I'd like to hear views, any for it, and what benefits can it bring? What do you see? Yeah, please.
One thing I was thinking about when talking about reclaiming of road space and sort of pedestrianizing Orchard Road is that currently Orchard Road is sort of planned for one-way lane with buildings on both sides, right? So the problem I see with Orchard Road is that along the road itself, there are no activities going on. So that sort of forces people to go somewhere where there's things to see, where there's things to do, and currently that's underground. So maybe my question is that, what can we do at this point of time where the buildings are already up, the roads are already there, to sort of inject the kind of life back into the streets?
No, but certainly, for instance, well, okay, you're talking about the Bahnhofstrasse in Zurich. You certainly do. In Switzerland, of course, you don't have good weather all year round like you have in Singapore. But there seem to be no outdoor, for instance, places to sit down, have a coffee or anything like that. I mean, all that somehow is missing in Orchard Road, where it could be. Something needs to be done in order to bring life back to Orchard Road. I mean, in the old days when you have a car park that converts to a food center at night, those days was very different from what we have today.
If you go to China, there's what is called Walk Street. Walk Street actually, and pedestrian mall. And you see a lot of activities. You see jugglers, you see, people doing Michael Jackson's type of things. And people walk around just to have a look at them, even the locals. So I think I agree with you that without any activities, it's no point. It's just the road closure and the motorists get angry.
So I think let's give some thought to Orchard Road. I think as LTA, now putting on my LTA hat, we would, in support of car light, we like to see reclamation of some road space progressively in Orchard Road. Whether we go full halt, we need to stage it, I believe, and we can get there. But it takes, like what someone says, it takes time for people to adjust. Those who are so used to. But as we put more lines into Orchard Road, as we increase the supply of public transport, I think people's traveling behavior will shift. We're optimistic. And then we clamp down on the car park in Orchard Road. We need to do that so that it doesn't generate, car trips don't generate there. But your rich Indonesian Thais may not take public transport to get the Gucci bag. That's the bit of trade-off. So they may have to find some way at the back and get people to shop for them, right? So that's the reality, because I think on the retail front, they also need to address some of these competition from online retail that's causing the buzz to go out. So I think we're all in agreement that you need some injection of activity, programming, live, place manager there. Stephen,
actually,
your kampong.
The way the car park design ingress is all from the back. So actually it's possible to do a partial closure, certain part of Orchard. That's why we did the 12-month trial on the pedestrian night to close Orchard for activities. But it's not that as an association we don't organize more activities. Orchard itself doesn't belong to LTA. You have SLA, you have M Park, you have URA. So there are many restrictions when you want to stage event activities. Except for illegal one, like see a lot illegal busker, they just use the space freely. But if you apply formally to use the space, you need to tie into with major events like Christmas. So throughout 12 months, you can most probably use up about 3 to 4 times a year because of the major event that we organize. So I think under the review, it's not just LTA. I think the whole policy, the usage of the public space need to review altogether to make it easier to flow events, flow business, and then to make the whole place more lively.
Thank you. Absolutely. We need the help of all agencies, flexibility in the placemaking, policies and all that. Glad to know that we are not alone in this.